The afternoon sun hung low over Riverside Park, casting long shadows that stretched across the manicured lawns like dark fingers reaching toward the playground equipment. It was a perfect late summer day in Denver, Colorado, the kind of day that made parents forget about the upcoming school year and teachers' emails and the endless cycle of activities that consumed their lives. The temperature hovered around 75 degrees, with just enough breeze to keep the heat from becoming oppressive. Children's laughter echoed across the open field, a sound so quintessentially American, so fundamentally innocent, that it seemed impossible anything tragic could occur on such a beautiful afternoon. Sarah sat on a weathered wooden bench near the playground, her eyes fixed on her 3-year-old daughter, Emma. Emma wore a yellow sundress with tiny white flowers embroidered across the front, and her dark curls bounced with each enthusiastic step. The little girl was completely mesmerized by the bottle of bubbles she held in her chubby fist, watching with wonder as colorful spheres floated away on the breeze. She chased after them with the unself-conscious abandon that only young children possess, her sandals slapping against the concrete path. Sarah smiled, that particular smile that comes only from watching your own child experience pure, unfiltered joy. She had left work early that day, an unusual occurrence that required careful maneuvering of her schedule, because Emma had been asking to come to the park all week. Sarah believed deeply in these small moments, the ones that would fade from memory but somehow remain imprinted on a child's heart. Nearby, other families dotted the landscape. A teenage boy threw a frisbee to his golden retriever. A father pushed a toddler on the swings, the child squealing with excitement. An elderly couple walked along the perimeter path, holding hands. Nobody paid particular attention to the small white van parked at the far end of the lot, the one with Denver Police Department K-9 unit stenciled along its side in bold blue letters. Police K-9 training exercises happened regularly at Riverside Park, usually in the designated off-leash area on the eastern side, where a fence separated the training zone from the public areas. The park had established this arrangement years ago, a compromise between law enforcement's need for realistic training environments and the public's right to use the facilities safely. Detective Williams, a 20-year veteran of the Denver Police Department, had been with the K-9 unit for 8 years. He was a stocky man in his late 40s, with salt and pepper hair and the kind of weathered face that comes from years of outdoor work. His K-9 partner, Storm, was a magnificent German Shepherd, a 3-year-old male who stood 28 inches at the shoulder and weighed 85 pounds of pure muscle and intelligence. Storm had been in training since puppyhood and was certified in multiple disciplines: narcotics detection, explosive detection, crowd control, and apprehension. The dog was considered one of the department's finest specimens, intelligent, responsive, and professional. Detective Williams trusted Storm completely. They had worked together for 3 years, and the bond between man and animal was palpable to anyone who observed them together. On this particular afternoon, Detective Williams was conducting a training exercise specifically focused on crowd control and public area navigation. The exercise was designed to prepare Storm for situations where the dog would need to maintain focus and respond to commands even amid distractions and chaos. The training scenario involved walking Storm through a crowded area, with multiple distractions deliberately introduced. A colleague was stationed nearby, ready to create scenarios that required Storm to remain alert but not reactive. The training area had been cordoned off, or at least that was the intention. However, the fence separating the K-9 training zone from the main park area had a gate, and that gate had been left partially ajar, a detail that would haunt Detective Williams for the rest of his life. Emma was completely absorbed in her bubble-chasing adventure when she wandered further from the path than she usually did. She was perhaps 30 yards from where Sarah sat, still within her mother's line of sight, but at the edge of the children's play area. Sarah wasn't worried. She could see Emma clearly, and the child was simply following a particularly large, shimmering bubble that the breeze kept lifting higher and further away. Emma's focus was absolute. In that moment, nothing existed for her but the bubble, the pursuit, and the pure, consuming joy of play. That was when Storm broke free. What happened next occurred in what felt like slow motion, but actually transpired in less than 7 seconds. A sudden commotion near the fence. Later, investigations would determine that Storm had simply pulled hard enough on his leash to slip the collar, caused the German Shepherd to bolt. Detective Williams called out commands, his voice sharp and authoritative, but the dog was already in motion, driven by the combination of training, instinct, and basic canine curiosity. The open gate beckoned, and Storm, never one to miss an opportunity to explore, squeezed through it and into the main park area. Sarah looked up from her phone at that exact moment and saw something that turned her blood to ice. A massive black and tan dog, a German Shepherd of intimidating proportions, was moving across the grass at a gallop directly toward her daughter. For a split second, Sarah's mind refused to process what she was seeing. Then instinct, primal and absolute, erupted through her body. She jumped to her feet so quickly that her phone clattered to the ground. A scream caught in her throat, not yet released, but building like a pressure that demanded release. Emma heard something. Whether it was the sound of the dog's paws thundering across the ground or some subtle shift in the energy of the park, her bubble chasing stopped. She turned, her small face registering confusion as she saw the enormous dog bearing down on her. Emma was small for her age, barely 30 pounds, and she stood alone in the open field with absolutely nowhere to run and nowhere to hide. The dog was moving fast, its ears alert, its mouth slightly open. To anyone watching, and several people were now watching with growing horror, it looked like the prelude to tragedy. Detective Williams was sprinting after his partner, shouting commands that seemed to dissipate into the afternoon air. "Storm! Down, down, heel!" Other parents began shouting. A woman near the swing stood up abruptly, her child momentarily forgotten. Someone yelled, "Call 911." The elderly couple froze on the walking path. All the peaceful contentment of the afternoon evaporated in an instant, replaced by the electric terror of a nightmare made manifest. Sarah began running toward Emma, her legs pumping, her breath coming in gasps, her mind screaming prayers that had no words. Time seemed to distort. The distance between her and her daughter felt simultaneously 10 feet and 1,000 miles. Emma stood frozen, her bubble wand still clutched in her hand, her expression shifting from confusion to something that might have been fear. The dog was perhaps 15 feet away now, 10 feet, 5 feet. Sarah's scream finally burst free, a sound of pure maternal anguish that would echo in her memory for years to come. Would Detective Williams reach them in time? Would he be able to call off his dog? What did Storm intend? Nobody knew. The collective breath of the entire park seemed to be held in suspension as the massive German Shepherd approached the tiny girl in the yellow flower dress, and the afternoon that had been so perfect, so beautiful, so innocently joyful, transformed instantly into something that felt dangerously, terrifyingly wrong. The screams echoed across Riverside Park for what felt like an eternity, but was actually only a few seconds. Storm skidded to a halt just inches from Emma, his massive paws digging into the grass. Detective Williams reached them within moments, his hands shaking as he grabbed the dog's collar and pulled Storm away from the frozen child. Emma's bubble wand fell from her fingers and shattered on the ground, the bubbles continuing their mindless float upward even as chaos erupted around them. Parents rushed toward Emma and Sarah, who had collapsed to her knees beside her daughter, checking frantically for injuries, tears streaming down her face. Other children cried, confused and frightened by the sudden violence. The peaceful afternoon had transformed into a scene of trauma and terror. But Emma was physically unharmed. The dog hadn't bitten her. There were no visible scratches, no bleeding, no broken bones. Detective Williams repeated apologies over and over, his face pale, sweat dripping down his temples. "I'm so sorry, the collar slipped, he's trained, he wouldn't hurt anyone, I'm so sorry." His words dissolved into meaningless repetition. Sarah didn't hear him. She was lost in a maternal fugue state, running her hands over Emma's body, looking for hidden injuries, unable to accept that her daughter had been spared. Emma, for her part, seemed oddly calm. She had experienced fear, yes, but the dog had not attacked her. It had simply come close, closer than any child should ever have to experience with a dangerous animal. That night Sarah didn't sleep. She lay in bed next to her sleeping daughter, watching Emma's chest rise and fall, replaying the moment over and over in her mind. What if Storm had bitten Emma? What if the dog had knocked her down? What if Detective Williams had been just 1 second slower? The possibilities spiraled into increasingly horrific scenarios that her mind seemed determined to explore in exhaustive detail. At 3 a.m., Sarah got up and went to her laptop. She began researching German shepherds, dog attacks, police negligence, and personal injury lawsuits. She read statistics about dog bites and hospital admissions. She watched video after video of dog attacks on the internet, each one fueling her growing conviction that her daughter had narrowly escaped catastrophe. By the time morning arrived, Sarah's fear had crystallized into something far more powerful and purposeful: rage. Pure, burning, focused rage. She called the Denver Police Department at 8:47 a.m. and demanded to speak to someone in internal affairs. The officer who answered tried to placate her, explaining that the incident was being reviewed, that these things happened, that Storm was a trained animal and hadn't actually bitten anyone. His calm, dismissive tone only intensified Sarah's fury. She hung up and immediately called her brother, Michael, who was a real estate attorney in Dallas. Though his specialty wasn't personal injury, Michael knew criminal defense attorneys, who knew personal injury lawyers. By noon, Sarah had been connected with David Martinez, a man whose reputation in Denver's legal community was formidable and occasionally controversial. David Martinez was 54 years old and had spent his career taking on institutions he believed were corrupt, negligent, or indifferent to ordinary people's suffering. He had won settlements against hospitals, police departments, and large corporations. He was known for his aggressive tactics, his willingness to go to trial when other lawyers would settle, and his almost evangelical belief that powerful institutions needed to be held accountable. When Sarah walked into his office that afternoon, Martinez could see something in her eyes that he recognized from decades of work: a mother's protective fury combined with a genuine sense of injustice. Within 2 hours, he had filed an official complaint with the Denver Police Department's Internal Affairs Division. Within 3 hours, he had begun drafting the civil lawsuit. "They endangered your daughter's life," Martinez told Sarah, his voice carrying absolute conviction. "The police department is responsible for ensuring their animals are properly controlled in public spaces. This is negligence, pure and simple, and we're going to make sure they understand the consequences of that negligence." Sarah found herself moving through the world in a strange state of determined resolve. She made a list of every person who had been at the park that day. She combed through her text messages and social media connections to locate witnesses. She created a document with photographs of the park layout, notes about the weather, details about the K-9 unit training that had been happening. She filled 3 notebooks with observations, concerns, questions, and increasingly elaborate theories about how the police department had failed its responsibility to the public. On the 4th day after the incident, Sarah made a decision that would change everything. She called a local news station and asked if they would be interested in covering a story about police negligence endangering a child. The producer who answered the phone immediately saw the potential. Within hours, Sarah found herself sitting in a television studio with bright lights and makeup, describing the harrowing moment when her daughter nearly died. Her words, though technically inaccurate, at the paws of an out-of-control police dog. "My daughter is 3 years old," Sarah said into the camera, her voice breaking with emotion that was entirely genuine, though perhaps somewhat enhanced by the knowledge that millions might be watching. "She went to the park to play with Bubbles. She should have been safe. The Denver Police Department had one responsibility: to ensure their animals were under control. They failed, catastrophically. The news segment aired that evening at 6 p.m. and again at 10 p.m. By the next morning, it had been posted on social media, and the comments section had exploded into a firestorm of outrage, support, and increasingly heated debate. Sarah's followers grew by thousands. People shared her story. Other parents came forward with their own concerns about police dogs in public spaces. Online petitions were created. Hashtags emerged. What had been a specific incident at one park was rapidly transforming into a broader conversation about public safety and police accountability. The Denver Police Department's Public Relations Office issued a carefully worded statement. "We are conducting a thorough investigation into the incident at Riverside Park. The K-9 officer involved followed all established protocols. Safety is our highest priority, and we take all concerns seriously." But Sarah and David Martinez weren't interested in official statements. They were interested in accountability. Martinez filed the civil lawsuit on day 7 after the incident, naming the city of Denver, the police department, and Detective Williams personally as defendants. The lawsuit sought $500,000 in damages, $250,000 for the child's emotional distress and medical expenses, $150,000 for the mother's emotional distress, and $100,000 in punitive damages, intended to send a message to the department about the seriousness of their negligence. Local media covered every filing. The story had legs, as journalists said, because it tapped into something primal in people's consciousness: the safety of children and the accountability of authority figures. Other parents began expressing concerns about the K-9 training area at their own neighborhood parks. Questions were asked at city council meetings. Detective Williams found himself recognized on the street, not as a decorated police officer, but as the man whose dog had nearly killed a 3-year-old girl. What Detective Williams actually knew was that the incident had lasted perhaps 4 seconds. What the public believed, based on news reports and social media accounts, was that he had allowed a dangerous animal to rampage through a public park with reckless abandon. The narrative had taken on a life of its own, growing more sinister and dramatic with each retelling. Sarah stood in her kitchen one morning, 2 weeks after the incident, scrolling through supportive messages from strangers on social media. These people believed in her. They believed in her fight for justice. They believed that she was protecting not just her daughter, but all the children in Denver. The validation fed something in her that had been hungry for a long time: the conviction that she was right, that she was noble, that her crusade was just. She didn't question whether her narrative was completely accurate. She didn't consider whether Emma's actual experience might be different from her interpretation of that experience. She was operating on a level of emotional and moral certainty that felt unshakable. The legal battle had truly begun. The formal documents arrived at the Denver Police Department's downtown headquarters in a manila envelope marked with the seal of Martinez and Associates, Personal Injury Law. The lawsuit, officially titled v. City of Denver, Denver Police Department and Detective Williams, was 37 pages long. The initial allegations were damning: negligence, failure to supervise, failure to maintain proper control of a dangerous animal, reckless endangerment of a minor, and emotional distress to both child and parent. The damages requested $500,000 represented a significant amount that would capture attention not just from the department, but from the city's insurance carriers and the mayor's office. The case was assigned to Judge in Denver District Court. Judge was 61 years old and had served on the bench for 23 years. She had a reputation that was complex and somewhat contradictory. She was known for being scrupulously fair, but also for being impatient with what she considered frivolous claims. She had previously ruled against both police defendants and plaintiffs who claimed police misconduct, depending on the facts and evidence presented. She was not the kind of judge who could be easily predicted or influenced by public opinion. Her chambers were decorated with photographs of her family and books about legal philosophy. She read every document filed in her cases personally, often late into the evening, making careful notes in the margins. When Judge read through the lawsuit on a Tuesday evening in September, she made several observations. First, the allegations were serious and demanded thorough investigation. Second, there was a discrepancy between how the incident was being portrayed in the media and how it was described in the legal documents. Third, the case would require expertise from multiple disciplines: veterinary behaviorism, trauma psychology, police procedures, and civil liability law. She made a note to schedule a preliminary hearing to discuss the scope of discovery and to set expectations about what evidence would be admissible. The Denver Police Department's response was swift and defensive. The department's legal counsel, Thomas Blake, was a 58-year-old prosecutor with 15 years of experience in civil litigation involving law enforcement. Blake had defended dozens of police officers in civil suits and had a win rate that hovered around 65%. He believed that police officers deserved the benefit of doubt when they were performing their duties in good faith, and he was confident that the case could be defeated. Blake immediately began gathering documentation: Detective Williams' personnel file, 20 years of exemplary service, no disciplinary records, Storm's training certifications and behavior records, park usage agreements, police procedures manuals, and photographic evidence from the scene. David Martinez, Sarah's attorney, was simultaneously conducting his own investigation. He hired Dr. Foster, a renowned animal behaviorist who had in numerous dog bite cases across the country. Dr. Foster reviewed police records and visited the park to assess the scene. She examined photographs of Storm and reviewed his training records. Martinez also retained a trauma psychologist, Dr. Richard, no relation to Sarah, to begin documenting Emma's psychological response to the incident. Emma began a series of appointments where Doctor assessed her emotional state, asking questions in age-appropriate ways, documenting signs of anxiety, fear responses, and behavioral changes. The psychological evaluation revealed that Emma was experiencing some anxiety responses. She expressed reluctance about going to the park. She had occasional nightmares. She displayed some regression in her behavior, asking for a pacifier, which she had abandoned months earlier, seeking more physical comfort from her mother. These findings, while not catastrophic or permanent, were documented and filed with the court. Doctor noted in his report that the degree of Emma's anxiety response was consistent with exposure to a frightening stimulus, which was technically accurate though somewhat vague. Judge scheduled the preliminary conference for October 15th. Both legal teams arrived prepared with documentation, arguments, and strategic positioning. Martinez argued that the scope of discovery should be broad, allowing for investigation into police training protocols, K-9 unit policies, incident reports, and departmental communications. Blake argued that while some discovery was appropriate, the defense needed protection from fishing expeditions and irrelevant inquiries that could burden his client with excessive paperwork and investigation costs. Judge listened to both arguments carefully, then issued her ruling. The scope of discovery would be broad but focused. Both sides would exchange all relevant documents within 60 days. Expert witnesses would be disclosed 90 days before trial. Depositions would begin in January. Trial was tentatively scheduled for May of the following year. The preliminary schedule gave both sides 8 months to prepare, which was both generous and demanding. Judge made clear that she expected thorough preparation, and that she had no patience for last-minute motions or trial delays. As news of the lawsuit and the court schedule spread through Denver's legal community and media landscape, the case began to take on symbolic significance. For some, it represented a necessary accountability of law enforcement. For others, it represented a dangerous tendency to sue first and ask questions later. Police unions began discussing supporting Detective Williams. Civil rights groups began discussing supporting Sarah. The case was becoming larger than the specific incident. It was becoming representative of broader tensions in American society about police accountability, public safety, and the appropriate use of force by authorities. Detective Williams found himself in an increasingly isolating position. While the department officially supported him and provided legal counsel, he was aware that his career was now in jeopardy. A conviction in this civil suit, or even a settlement that made it appear he was liable, could end his career in law enforcement. He found himself unable to sleep well, unable to concentrate on his work, moving through his days in a fog of anxiety and dread. Storm, sensing his handler's emotional distress, became somewhat more anxious himself, displaying behaviors that suggested the dog could perceive the tension surrounding their situation. Sarah, by contrast, felt increasingly empowered. Her social media following had grown to over 50,000 people. She received messages of support from parents around the country who shared their own stories of concerns about police dogs in public spaces. She was invited to speak at a community forum about K-9 unit safety. She began consulting with Martinez on strategy, feeling like she was becoming part of the legal team. In some ways, she had become the public face of a larger movement about institutional accountability. This role gave her identity and purpose in a way that her previous life, working as a marketing manager, managing a household, attending to the ordinary rhythms of suburban life, had not. The city's insurance carrier, a major national company, began conducting their own investigation into the incident and the department's policies. Insurance adjusters reviewed the K-9 unit's protocols and determined that while Detective Williams had followed established procedures, the fence maintenance and leash security systems could have been more robust. The insurance company quietly informed the city's legal team that they were assessing the likely liability exposure and that settlement discussions might be worth considering at some point. But Judge's preliminary ruling and the formal trial schedule had changed the dynamic. This was no longer going to be a quick settlement negotiation. This was going to be a full legal battle, fought through discovery, depositions, expert testimony, and ultimately a trial before a jury. The machinery of justice had been activated, and it moved forward with methodical, unstoppable force. Both sides began the serious work of building their cases, gathering evidence, interviewing witnesses, preparing for the intense scrutiny that trial would bring. The autumn months passed, leaves fell, the city prepared for winter, and underneath the normal rhythms of Denver life, two legal teams worked intensively to prepare for what would become one of the city's most unusual and consequential trials. The courtroom on the 15th floor of the Denver District Court building was packed on the morning the trial began in early May. Judge had authorized media coverage to a limited extent, and journalists lined the gallery alongside concerned citizens, legal observers, and interested members of the public. The case had generated enough attention that local news stations had assigned reporters to cover it full-time. The gallery filled up quickly, and courthouse security had to manage overflow crowds directing people to a separate room where the trial would be displayed on closed-circuit television. Detective Williams sat at the defense table in a gray suit, his jaw clenched, his hands folded carefully on the table in front of him. He had aged noticeably in the 8 months since the incident. His hair seemed grayer, his face more lined. The stress of the lawsuit had taken a physical toll. His attorney, Thomas Blake, sat beside him with an expression of controlled confidence, organized files and legal pads arranged precisely before him. Across the courtroom, Sarah sat with David Martinez. Sarah wore a navy blue dress that projected both professionalism and vulnerability. She had carefully coordinated her appearance with Martinez, neither too casual nor too formal, neither too fashionable nor too dowdy. Every detail was calculated to present a sympathetic figure to a jury of 12 strangers who would ultimately decide whether the police department was liable for negligence. Judge entered at 9:00 a.m. sharp and everyone rose. She took her seat and surveyed the courtroom with an expression that managed to be both warm and implacable. "Good morning," she said. "This is the case of v. City of Denver, Denver Police Department and Detective Williams. Mr. Martinez, you may begin your opening statement." David Martinez stood and approached the jury with the bearing of someone who had done this hundreds of times. He was a theatrical performer in the truest sense, using his voice, his body language, and his carefully chosen words to paint a picture for the jury. "Members of the jury," he began, "this is a case about responsibility, a case about institutions that are supposed to protect our citizens but sometimes fail in their most basic duties. On August 22nd of last year, a 3-year-old girl named Emma went to Riverside Park with her mother. Emma wasn't asking for anything extraordinary. She wasn't asking for perfection. She was simply asking for what every child deserves: safety. A place where she could play with bubbles and enjoy a beautiful afternoon without facing the threat of a dangerous animal controlled by a careless handler. Martinez paused, allowing his words to settle. He described the incident in vivid detail: the dog breaking free, the rush toward Emma, the terror of that moment. He presented it as a case study in institutional negligence: inadequate fencing, improper equipment, insufficient training, and reckless disregard for public safety. "When you hear the evidence," Martinez concluded, "you will understand that Detective Williams and the Denver Police Department made choices that endangered this child. And in our system of justice, those choices have consequences. We are asking for $500,000 in damages, not to punish, but to send a clear message that Denver's children deserve better." Thomas Blake then presented the defense opening statement. His approach was methodically different. "Members of the jury," he began, "this case is about two things: facts and responsibility. The facts are these: Detective Williams is a police officer with 20 years of exemplary service. Storm is a highly trained K-9 with extensive certification. On August 22nd, an unfortunate incident occurred when a leash accidentally came loose. However, and this is crucial, Storm did not bite anyone. Storm did not hurt anyone. What happened was a moment of canine curiosity that lasted a matter of seconds. Was it ideal? No. But was it negligence? That's what we need to examine carefully based on actual evidence, not on fear or emotion." Blake's approach was to differentiate between an accident and negligence, arguing that accidents happen to careful, well-trained people all the time. "The evidence will show," he continued, "that Detective Williams followed all established protocols, that the K-9 unit maintains rigorous standards, and that this was an unfortunate but isolated incident, not the result of negligence by a careless officer or a dangerous animal." The testimony began with Sarah's account. She was coached by Martinez to speak with emotional authenticity while remaining credible, to cry when appropriate without appearing manipulative. She described the terror of that moment, watching what she believed was certain tragedy unfold in slow motion. She about Emma's subsequent anxiety, the nightmares, the regression in behavior. The jury watched her carefully. Some members appeared sympathetic. Others seemed more analytical, trying to determine what was genuine experience and what was perhaps amplified by fear or legal strategy. Under cross-examination by Thomas Blake, Sarah's testimony became more complicated. Blake asked carefully crafted questions. "When the dog approached your daughter, did it bite her?" "No." "Did it knock her down?" "No." "Did it make physical contact with her at all?" "No, but please just answer the questions directly, Ms. Did the dog make physical contact?" "No." Each no diminished the narrative of catastrophe, replacing it with something more ambiguous. Then the witnesses began testifying, and their accounts diverged dramatically. Jennifer, the park visitor who had been sitting near the swings, that Storm appeared to be lunging aggressively toward Emma. She described the dog's posture as predatory, and said she had been certain they were about to witness a tragedy. Under cross-examination, Blake established that she had seen the incident from a distance, that her view was partially obstructed, and that she had no background in animal behavior. However, retired K-9 trainer captain for the defense that Storm's body language, as described by witnesses and captured in photographs taken moments after the incident, indicated curiosity rather than aggression. A dog preparing to attack would display very different physical markers: ears pinned back, hackles raised, forward lunging posture. Storm's ears were forward, his tail was neutral, his body language was consistent with investigation. Dr. Foster, the animal behaviorist retained by the plaintiff, that dogs and small children represented a potentially dangerous combination. She described scenarios where even friendly dogs could accidentally injure small children through sheer size and strength. She presented research on dog bite statistics and incidents involving K-9 units. However, under cross-examination by Blake, Dr. Foster acknowledged that she had not been present at the incident, that she was working primarily from descriptions and photographs, and that many K-9 units operate safely in public spaces without incident. Dr. Richard, Emma's psychologist, about her anxiety responses, but admitted under questioning that Emma's anxiety level, while present, was relatively mild. He acknowledged that exposure to a frightening stimulus didn't necessarily mean the stimulus was objectively dangerous. It simply meant it had been perceived as frightening. He also noted that Emma had not expressed verbally that she was afraid of dogs. Her anxiety manifested in more general ways. Then Detective Williams took the stand. He was visibly nervous, his hand shaking slightly as he was sworn in. However, once he began testifying, he demonstrated remarkable composure. He described his training, his credentials, his 20 years of police service. He explained K-9 protocols, the equipment used, the procedures that should have prevented the leash from coming loose. He acknowledged that the leash had failed, but explained that this was a mechanical failure, not a failure of supervision or judgment. He about his relationship with Storm, the dog's training and temperament, his confidence in the animal. When the leash broke, Williams, my first instinct was to call Storm back to me. I've trained with this dog for 3 years. I know his nature. I knew he wasn't attacking the child. He was investigating. Would I have preferred that he didn't approach her? Absolutely. But I also know from experience what an actual attack from Storm would look like, and this wasn't it. By the end of the first week of testimony, the jury's collective expression had shifted. They were no longer uniformly sympathetic to Sarah's narrative. The testimony had complicated the story. The picture that had seemed clear from the opening statements had become murky and uncertain. Facts that seemed straightforward, a dog approached a child, revealed themselves to be susceptible to radically different interpretations, depending on who was describing them and what framework they were using to understand them. Judge observed everything silently, her face remaining impassive, her pen moving constantly as she made notes. She was tracking not just the testimony but the underlying narratives, the assumptions each side was making, the ways in which fear and experience were being filtered through different lenses. She would need to guide the jury carefully toward understanding what the law actually required them to evaluate, not whether the incident was scary, but whether it constituted negligence under the specific legal definition applicable in Colorado. The trial continued, and with each day of testimony, the certainty that had dominated public discourse about the case became increasingly elusive. The trial had been proceeding for 9 days when David Martinez made a decision that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of the case. He was sitting in his office late one evening, reviewing transcripts of the testimony, when he realized that something crucial was missing from the trial record: Emma's own voice. Yes, Doctor had about her psychological state. Yes, Sarah had about observing her daughter's behavior, but nobody had actually asked Emma what she remembered about that day. The child herself, the person at the center of the lawsuit, the person for whom damages were being sought, remained a silent figure in her own case. This realization struck Martinez with unexpected force. For months, he had been constructing a narrative about trauma and negligence, building his case on expert testimony and adult interpretation. But what if he was wrong about something fundamental? What if Emma's actual memory was different from what the adults around her believed it to be? The thought was uncomfortable because it suggested the possibility that his entire strategy might be built on a foundation that didn't match reality. Martinez discussed the idea with his paralegal, Jennifer, who looked at him with considerable skepticism. "Emma's 3 years old," Jennifer said. "You want to put her on the stand, in front of a jury, with the media watching. That's insane. That's not good lawyering, that's child abuse." "Maybe," Martinez acknowledged. "But what if her testimony supports us? What if she describes being terrified, describes genuine trauma? Then we have the most powerful testimony possible, coming directly from the victim." "And what if she describes something different?" Jennifer asked quietly. "What if she says the dog was nice? What if she says she wasn't scared? Then we've just destroyed our own case." Martinez sat with that thought for a long moment. Jennifer's concern was legitimate. In the adversarial system of law, attorneys typically didn't call witnesses unless they were confident about what those witnesses would say. Putting Emma on the stand was a gamble, possibly a catastrophic one. But Martinez had spent decades in law, and he had learned something that many younger attorneys missed. Sometimes the biggest risks led to the greatest rewards, not because of legal strategy, but because of truth. And the truth, particularly the truth delivered directly from the mouth of a 3-year-old, had a power that no expert testimony could match. He called Sarah at home that evening. "I want to put Emma on the stand," he said without preamble. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "What?" Sarah finally responded. "She's 3 years old. She can barely talk. She doesn't understand what a courtroom is. Why would you?" "Because," Martinez interrupted, "the jury needs to hear from her. Not from you about her, not from a psychologist evaluating her, but from Emma herself about what she experienced." "David, I don't know," Sarah said, and for the first time in months Martinez heard uncertainty in her voice. "What if she gets scared? What if the courtroom is traumatic for her? What if?" "What if she tells the truth?" Martinez finished. "That's what I'm hoping for. I'm hoping that when Emma talks about what happened that day, the jury will hear authenticity that cuts through all the arguments and expert testimony. I'm hoping they'll hear a child's clear, uncomplicated account of her own experience." Sarah agreed, though reluctantly. Martinez spent the next 3 days preparing. He met with Emma and her therapist, Doctor, to discuss how to prepare a 3-year-old for courtroom testimony. They established that Emma could understand basic concepts: truth, a court, a judge. They worked with her on staying calm in unfamiliar environments. They explained, in age-appropriate language, that she would go to a big room with lots of people and answer simple questions about the day at the park. But they didn't coach her on what to say. This was crucial. Martinez specifically instructed Sarah not to discuss with Emma what she should say about the incident. He wanted her responses to be as untainted as possible by adult expectations or interpretation. On the morning that Martinez filed his formal motion requesting permission for Emma to testify, Judge Chambers erupted with activity. Thomas Blake, when informed of the plaintiff's intention to call a 3-year-old as a witness, filed an immediate motion in opposition. His argument was comprehensive and forceful. Children under 5 were generally considered incompetent to testify because they lacked the cognitive ability to understand the nature of an oath, to distinguish between truth and imagination, and to meaningfully communicate about events. Putting a child on the stand was, Blake argued, potentially traumatic for the child and unfair to the defendant, because it would inevitably prejudice the jury, who would be emotionally moved by the child's presence regardless of what she actually said. Judge scheduled a hearing on the motion for the following morning. The courtroom was packed. News outlets had caught wind of the unusual request, and media interest intensified. This was the kind of dramatic courtroom development that television news lived for, a child about to testify in a major case. Judge reviewed the legal precedent carefully. While 3-year-olds rarely in court, it was not explicitly prohibited. The question was whether Emma possessed the basic competence to testify, and whether allowing her to do so would serve the interests of justice or whether it would primarily serve to manipulate the jury through emotional appeal. She asked to speak with Emma first in chambers outside the formal courtroom setting. Martinez, Blake, Sarah, and Emma's therapist were present. Emma was brought into the judge's office, a space that had been deliberately made less intimidating than the courtroom. Judge had asked that Emma sit in a comfortable chair rather than in the witness stand. The judge spoke to her gently, asking her simple questions to assess her understanding. "Emma, do you know what truth is?" Judge asked. Emma nodded seriously. "It's when you tell what really happened." "And do you know what a lie is?" "When you say something that didn't happen," Emma responded. The questions continued, gentle and carefully calibrated. Judge asked Emma about the day at the park. Emma remembered going to the park. She remembered the bubbles. She remembered the dog coming close. When Judge asked if the dog had scared her, Emma hesitated, seeming to consider the question seriously. "The dog was big," Emma finally said, "and loud, but I think the dog was nice." Judge and the adults exchanged glances. That single sentence, "I think the dog was nice," contained the potential to dramatically reshape the trial. After the interview, Judge reconvened in her chambers with both attorneys. Her expression was thoughtful and conflicted. "The child understands the basic concept of truth versus falsehood," she said. "She seems to understand the consequences of what she's saying. From a legal standpoint, I believe she possesses minimal competence to testify." She paused, her hands folded on her desk. "However," she continued, "I'm deeply concerned about whether calling her is in her best interest. This is a high-profile case. There will be media attention. There will be intense questioning. She will be placed in a formal legal setting at an age when such settings are inherently stressful." Judge looked directly at David Martinez. "Mr. Martinez, are you aware that your own client's daughter has just told me, in confidence, that she thinks the dog was nice? Are you prepared for that statement to potentially undermine your case?" Martinez met her gaze steadily. "Yes, Your Honor, I believe the truth, whatever it is, serves my client's interests better than a constructed narrative." Judge nodded slowly. "I'm going to allow Emma to testify, but with specific protections. The questioning will be limited. I will oversee all questions personally to ensure they're age-appropriate. The child will testify in a modified courtroom setting, not the full formal gallery. Her mother will sit nearby, and I'm warning both counsel that if this becomes exploitative or traumatic, I will stop the testimony immediately. Do you understand?" Both attorneys nodded. "Furthermore," Judge continued, looking at Martinez, "I want you to understand something, Mr. Martinez. I'm allowing this because I believe the jury deserves to hear directly from the child about her own experience. But I'm also allowing this because I believe that sometimes the truth, however it manifests, serves justice better than strategy. If your case is built on facts that are accurate, then the truth will support it. If it's built on assumptions or exaggerations, then the truth will expose that. Either way, the interests of justice are served." Martinez left the chambers with a strange mixture of confidence and anxiety. He had gotten what he wanted, but he also understood what Judge was really saying. She was creating an opportunity for truth to emerge, even if that truth contradicted his litigation strategy. He had invited Emma to tell her story, and he was about to discover whether her story aligned with the narrative he had constructed or whether it would fundamentally challenge it. The stage was being set for something unprecedented in the trial, the moment when a 3-year-old child would speak directly into the legal record about her own experience, unfiltered by adult interpretation, witnessed by a jury of 12 people who would have to reconcile her account with everything they had heard over the previous 9 days of testimony. The morning of Emma's testimony arrived with the kind of perfect spring weather that seemed to mock the gravity of what was about to transpire. The sun streamed through the courthouse windows, bright and cheerful, indifferent to the tension that gripped the building. News vans lined the street outside, reporters standing with their cameras ready, waiting to capture whatever would happen inside. The story had taken on a life of its own in Denver's media landscape. 3-year-old to testify in police dog lawsuit. It was the kind of human interest angle that television news couldn't resist. Judge had arranged for a modified courtroom setup. Rather than Emma sitting in the formal witness stand with its imposing height and official appearance, a small chair had been placed at the front of the courtroom, positioned so that she could see Judge directly without being elevated above the crowd. A small table with a glass of water was placed beside the chair, a comfort measure. Sarah sat in the gallery directly behind where Emma would testify, close enough for the child to see her mother's face. The regular courtroom gallery had been emptied except for essential personnel. Judge had been strict about this. Media cameras were absolutely not permitted inside the courtroom. The jury would be present, as would the attorneys, court personnel, and Emma's therapist as an observer. But the public spectacle had been minimized as much as possible to reduce the intimidation factor for the child. Emma arrived at the courthouse wearing a small pink dress with a white collar and white socks pulled up to her knees. She carried a small stuffed rabbit that her therapist had suggested might provide comfort. She looked impossibly small as she was led into the courtroom by Sarah's hand. When she saw the large, formal space, the high ceilings, the judge's elevated bench, the jury box with 12 adult faces watching her, her eyes widened visibly. She gripped her rabbit and looked back at her mother with an expression that was part curiosity, part apprehension. Judge smiled warmly at Emma, working to make the moment feel less intimidating. "Hello, Emma," she said gently. "I'm Judge. I want to thank you for coming here today. You're being very brave. I need to ask you some questions about the day you were at the park. Is that okay?" Emma nodded slowly, not speaking. "Emma, before we start, I need to explain something. When you're in court, you have to tell the truth. That means you tell what really happened, not what you wish happened or what someone else told you happened, but what you actually remember. Do you understand?" "Uh-huh," Emma said, her voice barely audible. "And when you tell the truth here in court, that's called testimony. It's very important. Can you promise to tell me the truth today?" Emma nodded seriously, still clutching her rabbit. "I promise." In the gallery, Sarah held her breath. Thomas Blake sat at the defense table, his expression carefully neutral, but his fingers were tapping lightly on the table, a sign of tension barely concealed. Detective Williams stared straight ahead, his face unreadable but his shoulders slightly hunched, as if bracing for impact. Judge began with easy, foundational questions designed to help Emma relax and to establish that she could communicate clearly. "Emma, do you know what your last name is?" Emma said. "That's right. And Emma, do you remember going to the park with your mommy?" "Yes, we went to play." "That's right. What did you do at the park?" "I played with bubbles. Mommy bought me bubbles and I was blowing them and chasing them." The jury listened intently. One juror, an older woman in the back row, smiled slightly at the innocent recollection. "Emma, do you remember something happening at the park? Something with a dog?" Emma's entire body seemed to tense at the question. She looked toward the photograph of Storm that had been entered into evidence and displayed in the courtroom. Her hand reached unconsciously toward her rabbit, seeking its comfort. "The dog came," Emma said quietly. "Tell me about the dogs, Emma. What do you remember about the dog?" There was a long pause, 30 seconds, 45 seconds. In a courtroom, silence feels enormous, stretching, demanding to be filled. The jury leaned forward slightly, waiting. Judge waited patiently, not prompting, allowing Emma to access her own memory in her own time. "The dog was big," Emma finally said. "Really big. I never saw a dog so big before." "How did the big dog make you feel? Judge asked carefully. Another long pause. Emma's eyes moved around the courtroom, as if she were searching for the right words in some internal dictionary of 3-year-old emotions and experiences. I was scared, but Emma hesitated, her small face scrunched in concentration as she tried to articulate something she had apparently never verbalized before. But what, Emma? Judge encouraged gently. But the dog didn't do anything bad, Emma said, her words coming slowly, as if she were working hard to be accurate. The dog just came close, and the man told the dog to go away, and the dog went away. In the gallery, Sarah's face had gone pale. Her hand covered her mouth. This was not the testimony she had been hoping for, not the account of trauma and danger that would support her case. David Martinez kept his face impassive, but internally he felt something shift. The foundation he had built his case upon was cracking. His own client's daughter was delivering testimony that contradicted the narrative of negligence and endangerment that he had constructed. Judge continued with careful, neutral questions. When the dog came close to you, did it hurt you? No, Emma said. Did it bite you? No. Did it knock you down? No. Did it do anything to hurt you at all? Emma shook her head firmly. No, it was just close. And then Judge asked the question that would become the defining moment of the entire trial. Emma, how do you feel about the dog now? If you saw the dog again today, what would you think? Emma's face transformed. Her eyes brightened. A small smile appeared at the corners of her mouth. She pointed directly at the photograph of Storm displayed in the courtroom, then at Detective Williams sitting at the defense table. In a clear, steady voice that cut through the absolute silence of the courtroom, Emma said, "Dog nice." The two words hung in the air like a bell that had been struck, sending reverberations through everyone present. Dog. Nice. Two simple English words spoken by a 3-year-old child, yet they contained within them a profound challenge to everything that had been argued and during the previous 9 days of trial. The courtroom erupted. Not loudly, Judge maintained strict control, but audibly. There were gasps, whispered exclamations, the sound of someone in the gallery drawing a sharp breath. Sarah began crying, tears streaming down her face, but these were not the tears of vindication she had anticipated. They were tears of recognition, of sudden, uncomfortable understanding. The case she had built on fear and interpretation was being unmade by her own daughter's clear-eyed innocence. David Martinez felt the room spinning slightly. His career had been built on reading juries, on understanding how to move people through narrative and evidence. But he had not anticipated this, had not truly anticipated his own client's daughter contradicting the entire foundation of the lawsuit. He had gambled on Emma's testimony, and the gamble was not paying off the way he had hoped. Judge raised her gavel and called for silence. Order in the court. There will be no outbursts. She looked at Emma with an expression of profound gentleness. Emma, you've been very brave and you've told me the truth, and I'm very proud of you. Thank you for coming here. Emma nodded solemnly, swinging her legs slightly in the small chair, seemingly unaware of the cataclysmic impact her words had just had on the case surrounding her. We're going to take a 30-minute recess, Judge announced. I want both counsel to meet with me in chambers. Emma, you're going to go back with your mommy now, and you did a wonderful job. As Sarah collected Emma and led her from the courtroom, the child looked completely untouched by the drama her testimony had created. She was more interested in the water that had been provided than in the gravity of what she had just said. She clutched her rabbit and asked her mother, "Can we go get ice cream?" In chambers, the atmosphere was dramatically different from what either side had anticipated. Judge sat behind her desk, her fingers steepled, her expression contemplative. "Well," she said quietly, "that was unexpected, wasn't it?" Judge's chambers were a sanctuary of quiet after the dramatic eruption in the courtroom. The walls were lined with law books, their spines worn from years of consultation. Photographs of her family, her husband, 3 adult children and 5 decorated the shelves. These personal touches stood in stark contrast to the formal legal documents stacked on her desk. She sat behind that desk now, regarding both David Martinez and Thomas Blake with an expression that was difficult to read. A court reporter sat to the side, recording everything that was said, because even private chambers conversations in significant cases became part of the record. Judge began, her voice measured and thoughtful. I think we need to have a conversation about what just happened and what happens next. David Martinez was still visibly shaken. His carefully constructed case had just been dismantled by his own client's daughter in less than 15 minutes of testimony. He struggled to find words. Your Honor, the child's testimony was affected by. By what? Judge interrupted gently but firmly. By her own clear recollection of events. By her innocent memory untainted by adult interpretation. Please, Mr. Martinez, don't insult this court by suggesting that a 3-year-old somehow didn't understand what she was saying or that her testimony was manipulated. I saw her in chambers. I saw her in the courtroom. That child was telling you the truth as she experienced it. Martinez sat back, deflated. Thomas Blake, trying to conceal his satisfaction, remained silent. Judge continued, her tone shifting to something more contemplative, less judicial and more philosophical. I have been on this bench for 23 years, she said. I have presided over thousands of cases. I have seen brilliant attorneys construct compelling narratives from fragmentary facts. I have seen juries move to tears and anger and conviction based on testimony that was technically accurate but fundamentally misleading. I have seen the legal system work magnificently to serve justice, and I have seen it work brilliantly to serve injustice. She paused, choosing her next words carefully. What I witnessed today was something different, she continued. I witnessed a child speaking a truth so clear, so uncomplicated, so fundamentally honest that it cut through 9 days of legal arguments, expert testimony, and competing narratives like a light through darkness. That child has no stake in this case beyond her own experience. She was not performing for a jury. She was not trying to help her mother or hurt Detective Williams. She was simply telling what she remembered. Martinez felt his face burning. He had been so focused on winning, on building a case, on pursuing what he believed was justice for his client, that he had never truly considered whether his interpretation of events matched objective reality. The lawsuit had become about the litigation itself, about the strategy and the narrative, about defeating an opponent. And in that process, he had potentially distorted his client's own daughter's actual experience. The question before us now, Judge said, leaning forward, is not what happened on August 22nd. I think that's become quite clear. The question is, what does justice look like in this situation? And that, I believe, requires me to think beyond the strict parameters of civil liability and consider something broader about what happened to this family, what happened to this community, and what the law should do in response. She stood and walked to her window, looking out over Denver's downtown skyline. Mr. Martinez, you brought this case because you believed your client had been wronged. That's your job as an attorney. You built a narrative that explained that wrong and sought compensation for it. That's what civil litigation is designed to do. But now we have evidence, delivered by the most credible witness in this entire trial, that the wrong you alleged may not actually have occurred. The child wasn't traumatized by a dangerous animal. She was frightened by a large dog, and she recovered from that fright quite quickly. She turned back to face them. Detective Williams, under the laws of Colorado and the standards of police procedure, was he negligent? Was there a failure to maintain proper control of his K-9 partner? Technically, yes. The leash broke. That's a mechanical failure. Whether it constitutes actionable negligence under law is a different question. But what I'm now wondering is whether the legal framework we're using to evaluate this incident captures what actually matters. Judge returned to her seat. I'm going to rule, she said, but before I do, I want you both to understand my reasoning. This case has been in many ways a case study in how adult fear can reshape a child's experience. Ms. was terrified. That terror was real and understandable. A mother saw danger and her protective instinct activated. But her daughter's experience was different. Her daughter was scared briefly, and then she was fine. She remembered an encounter with a large animal, and her actual memory of that encounter was not traumatic. It was neutral, even somewhat positive. She opened a document on her desk, her notes from Emma's testimony. The child's actual words, repeated multiple times in cross-examination and reconfirmed by her own testimony, were consistent. The dog was big, she was frightened by its size and sudden approach, but it didn't hurt her, didn't attack her, didn't do anything inherently dangerous. The danger existed primarily in adult interpretation of the dog's intentions, not in the dog's actual behavior. Martinez felt something shifting inside him, a recognition of something uncomfortable but true. He had been so invested in his narrative that he had stopped truly listening to the evidence. Furthermore, Judge continued, I have to consider the impact of this litigation on the very child I'm supposed to be protecting. Ms., you brought this case to protect your daughter, but in doing so, you have transformed a moment of childhood fright into a legal drama that has dominated this child's life for 9 months. You have hired psychologists to evaluate her. You have had her testify in a high-profile case with media attention. You have framed her experience as traumatic when her own memory suggests it was brief and ultimately non-threatening. I have to ask myself, did the legal battle to protect your daughter from an incident that didn't actually traumatize her end up causing her more harm than good? Sarah, sitting in the gallery, felt tears streaming down her face, tears of a different quality than before. These were tears of recognition, of painful self-awareness. Judge addressed the court reporter. Let the record show that I am ruling as follows. The civil lawsuit, v. City of Denver, Denver Police Department and Detective Williams, is dismissed. The defendant is found to have followed all established protocols in accordance with police procedure. While the mechanical failure of the leash represents a maintenance issue that should be addressed, it does not constitute actionable negligence under Colorado law. She paused, making clear that this was not the end of her statement. However, she continued, I am directing the Denver Police Department to conduct a comprehensive review of K-9 unit equipment, maintenance procedures, and public space training protocols. I am recommending, though not ordering, that the department implement improved communication with the public regarding K-9 training activities. I'm also recommending that the city consider whether the current system of public space K-9 training adequately balances law enforcement training needs with public safety concerns. She removed her reading glasses and addressed both sides directly. But I want to make something else clear, for the record, and for the benefit of everyone in this courtroom and everyone who will read this decision. This case has revealed something important about how litigation, media attention, and adult anxiety can reshape childhood experience. A frightened child became a traumatized victim. A brief incident became a symbol of institutional negligence. A normal, manageable fear response became grounds for a $500,000 lawsuit. Judge looked directly at Sarah. Ms., you are a mother who loves her daughter. That love is evident and real. But I want to ask you to reflect on something. Your daughter has told you under oath that she thinks the dog is nice. She has told this court that the dog didn't hurt her. She has recovered from the incident faster than you have. I wonder if the greatest gift you could give your daughter now would not be the vindication of your case, but the modeling of reflection, humility, and the ability to see situations as they actually are rather than as we fear them to be. She turned to Detective Williams. Detective Williams, you are a dedicated police officer. Your record is exemplary. What happened was an accident, a mechanical failure of equipment, not a failure of judgment or training. While I hope the department will implement the improvements I have recommended, I want you to know that this court does not find you to be negligent or culpable in any meaningful way. You responded appropriately to the incident. You maintained your professional composure. You did not abuse your authority. This case, in my judgment, should not have been brought in its current form." She addressed the jury, though they would not be needed for deliberation now that a judgment had been entered. "Members of the jury, you have listened to 9 days of testimony. You have seen expert witnesses disagree. You have heard conflicting interpretations of the same events. You have just heard a 3-year-old child speak a truth that cuts through all of that complexity. That, I think, is a lesson worth remembering about the limits of expertise and the power of direct observation and honest testimony." The judge gathered her documents. "This court is adjourned. The case is closed, but I hope that everyone involved in this matter will take time to reflect on what happened here, not just the legal facts, but the human dimensions of this conflict and what we might have done differently." As the attorneys gathered their materials and began to leave the chambers, Judge called out one more time, "Mr. Martinez, Mr. Blake, excellent work from both of you. This was a complex and challenging case, and you both represented your clients zealously and professionally. But I want you both to remember that the pursuit of justice sometimes requires us to question not just our opponent's positions, but our own assumptions. That's what happened here." The ruling was delivered. The legal battle was over, but for everyone involved, the real reckoning was just beginning. The weeks following Judge's ruling were transformative in ways that nobody could have predicted. The media coverage, which had been intense during the trial, suddenly shifted tone. Rather than reporting on a victory for either side, journalists began discussing the broader implications of the case. Legal scholars wrote analyses of Judge's decision. Some praised her wisdom. Others criticized her for exceeding the traditional bounds of judicial authority by inserting moral commentary into her ruling. But regardless of the criticism, her words had resonated with something fundamental in the public consciousness, a recognition that the legal system, while designed to determine facts and assign liability, sometimes lost sight of truth in the pursuit of victory. Sarah sat in her therapist's office 2 weeks after the verdict, a therapist she had begun seeing not to document trauma from the park incident, but to process her own role in the cascade of events that had followed it. The therapist, doctor, was a woman in her 60s with gray hair and an expression of profound compassion. Sarah had been hesitant to seek therapy. Part of her had wanted to continue believing in her narrative, wanted to continue seeing herself as a protective mother fighting for her daughter's rights. But Judge's words had planted a seed of doubt that she could no longer ignore. "I made it worse," Sarah said during one session, her voice small and broken. "I took something that happened to Emma, a scary moment that she processed and moved past, and I turned it into a trauma. I made her relive it over and over. I hired psychologists to evaluate her. I took her to depositions. I put her on the witness stand in front of a jury." Doctor remained silent, allowing Sarah to continue her own journey of discovery. "And the worst part," Sarah continued, tears flowing, "is that I did it all while believing I was helping her. I told myself it was about accountability, about justice, about protecting all the children in Denver. But really, I think it was about my fear of what could have happened, my inability to accept that my daughter had experienced something scary and had survived it intact." Sarah paused, looking out the window at the Denver skyline. "Emma asked me yesterday if we could go back to Riverside Park. She wants to play in the bubbles again. She's not afraid. She's not traumatized. She's just ready to move on, but I'm the one who's struggling." This realization, deeply uncomfortable and profoundly important, became the foundation for Sarah's own healing. She began the process of reaching out to the people she had hurt in pursuit of her case. She sent a letter to Detective Williams, not through lawyers but directly, a handwritten note that said simply, "I'm sorry. I misunderstood what happened. I let my fear drive my actions. I hope you can forgive me." Detective Williams received the letter at the police station. He read it standing in the break room, surrounded by the ordinary sounds of police work, phones ringing, officers joking, the background hum of institutional routine. He had been reinstated to full duty following the court's ruling, but something in him had shifted. The experience of being sued, of having his reputation questioned, of being portrayed in the media as negligent and dangerous, had left permanent marks. His confidence in his work had been shaken. He questioned his judgment in ways he never had before. But Sarah's letter, her genuine apology and admission of her own role in the distortion, created an unexpected opening. He called her number, his hands shaking slightly as he dialed. When Sarah answered, her voice cautious and uncertain, he said simply, "I got your letter. Thank you for sending it. I think we should talk. Not about the case, just talk." They met on a Saturday afternoon at a coffee shop far from either of their neighborhoods, a neutral space where they could have a conversation without the weight of their legal history. Detective Williams was nervous in a way that surprised him. He had faced dangerous situations in his career without this particular kind of anxiety. But as Sarah walked in, looking smaller than he remembered, more vulnerable, he felt something shift in his chest. They sat across from each other, coffee cups steaming between them. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Sarah said, "I need you to understand something. I wasn't trying to destroy you. I was terrified. I saw my daughter approach a large dog, and in my mind I saw all the worst possibilities. I went to the worst place I could imagine." Detective Williams nodded slowly. "I understand that now. I didn't at first. When I was being sued, when the media was portraying me as negligent, I was angry. I felt wronged, but Judge's ruling, it made me think about things differently. Yes, the leash failed. That was my responsibility, and I have to accept that. But it also made me realize something. I think I understand now what you were experiencing. Not the legal case, but the underlying terror. If I had a daughter and something like that happened, I think I would have been afraid too." Sarah felt tears beginning again, but this time they felt cleaner, less weighted by anger or defensiveness. "The thing that keeps haunting me," she said, "is that Emma's actual experience was so different from what I made it into. She saw a big dog. She was startled. And then she moved on. She's been trying to move on the whole time, and I've been dragging her back into it." "What about now?" Detective Williams asked. "What happens now?" Sarah took a deep breath. "I was thinking, and this might be crazy, I was wondering if maybe Emma could meet Storm, not as part of any lawsuit or legal thing, just as a child meeting a dog on neutral ground, without all the adult complications." Detective Williams looked startled, then thoughtful. "I think that could be healing," he said quietly. "For Emma, for you, for me too, maybe." 2 weeks later, on a sunny Saturday morning in June, Sarah and Emma arrived at Washington Park with Detective Williams and Storm. The dog bounded from the police van with enthusiasm, his massive frame belying his gentle nature. Emma, seeing Storm, initially hung back, holding her mother's hand. But as the dog approached with a wagging tail and playful demeanor, something remarkable happened. Emma's face transformed into pure joy. "Dog nice," she exclaimed, her actual words coming true in real time, as if she had always known something that the adults around her had failed to understand. Detective Williams led Storm in circles around the park, while Emma rode on the dog's back, laughing with complete abandon. Sarah watched her daughter, seeing for the first time the girl who hadn't been traumatized by the park incident. She saw the Emma who had been telling the truth all along. The dog was nice. The experience had been scary but not damaging. The memory had been processed and integrated without requiring the machinery of the legal system to validate her experience. As they walked through the park, Sarah and Detective Williams talked about systemic change. He had been working with the police department on improving K-9 training protocols, implementing better equipment maintenance and public safety measures. Sarah had begun volunteering with a parent education organization that focused on helping parents distinguish between protecting their children and projecting their own anxieties onto their children's experiences. "I'm thinking about something," Sarah said as they watched Emma play. "I'm thinking about writing about this, not as a lawsuit narrative but as a reflection on how fear can distort our judgment, about how the people we love can sometimes teach us truths if we're willing to listen." "I think that would be powerful," Detective Williams said, "because the truth is, We were both right and both wrong. You were right that the incident happened and that someone should take responsibility. I was right that it was an accident, not negligence. But we were both wrong about what it meant for Emma. Emma ran up to her mother, breathless and joyful. "Mommy, Mommy, can we come back? Can we play with Storm again?" Sarah looked at her daughter, this beautiful, resilient, uncomplicated 3-year-old who had taught all the adults in her orbit a profound lesson through the simple act of speaking her truth. "Yes, baby, we can come back. We'll come back as many times as you want." As the afternoon light shifted across the park, casting long shadows that were gentle rather than threatening, something approached resolution. Not a legal resolution, Judge's ruling had already provided that, but a human resolution. A moment where fear gave way to understanding, where litigation gave way to dialogue, where narrative gave way to truth. Emma played with Storm until she was exhausted, flopping onto the grass beside the massive dog who licked her face with overwhelming gentleness. Sarah sat nearby with Detective Williams, and they didn't speak much, but they didn't need to. They had both learned something that couldn't be captured in legal documents or expert testimony. They had learned that sometimes the simplest truths come from the mouths of children, and that the greatest wisdom often lies in recognizing when we have been wrong and having the courage to change course. Judge's decision had closed the legal case, but it had opened something more important, a pathway to genuine understanding between people who had been positioned as adversaries. And in a world often fractured by litigation and conflict, that pathway toward human connection represented something rarer and more valuable than any courtroom victory. The dog, the child, and the two adults sat together in the golden afternoon light, and in that moment, the narrative that had consumed months of their lives finally gave way to something simpler and more true. Just a child, an animal, and the unconditional joy that exists when we stop filtering reality through our fears and simply allow things to be what they actually are.